Who knew that dogs go to heaven? This is how I found out. My adventure started 132 years ago. I was born on a green farm on top of a rugged cliff overlooking the windswept ocean in Maine. When the farmers came down the cliff to collect seaweeds, we would go down with them and swim. I loved swimming. I heard people say that I was good at it. One day, a man came from Portland to look at my brothers and sisters. Mom growled at him, but he lifted me, played with me, then he took me with him. We took a train and arrived in a big city with lots of noise, lots of people, and lots of horses. It was scary at first, but I got used to it. I moved in with the man in a small apartment, and we quickly became a family. Listening to people, I found that his name was William Copeland, but people called him Bill, and Bill called me Jack, and Bill's friends called me Jack, the giant black dog. A year or so after I left my native farm, Bill and I took the train and we went west. Bill and his friends always talked about going west to find fortune, love, and adventure, and we found everything except for fortune. We went from town to town, from camp to camp, and from mine to mine. We never stayed long in one place. We were happy together, but Bill was still looking for riches. On a lovely spring afternoon, we arrived in Butte. It was busy and full of energy, life, and smoke, and finally we stayed here. Bill thought that it was too cold in the winter, but the cold never bothered me. I liked it. Bill kept looking for the right job. At night on his free time and between jobs, he volunteered for the fire department. Bill liked the uniform that caught the attention of young women, and I liked that I was able to follow him sometimes whenever he went on a call. We saw a lot of fires. We saw a lot of deaths and a lot of buildings destroyed. Bill was never afraid. I kept looking at him. I was so proud of him. One night, I was proudest of all. It was getting late and extremely cold. We were in the apartment on Galena Street. Bill had been reading, and I had been sleeping by the fire. Later on, Bill put on his uniform, and then we walked into the icy darkness. We made our way to the central fire station. Soon after we arrived, we heard a loud alarm. The horses were harnessed to carriages and the engines, and Bill jumped on one of them, rushing down the hill. He asked me to wait for him, and so I reluctantly went back into the station, and I waited anxiously for his return. From a distance, I could see monstrous flames leaping out of a warehouse. The searing glow was slicing through the cold air. I imagined that Bill and the other men immediately went to work, as I so often observed. And then came the first blast. I could now hear screams and the distinct moan of a horse. I immediately got the premonition of a tragic loss. And then came the fatal blow, a cruel and mighty blast. Everything shook inside the station. The windows shattered and the front door burst open. For a while it took my breath away. I worried frantically about Bill, and I ran out. When I arrived a moment later at the site of the explosion, people were rushing from all over town to try and help. People and horses were lying down, covered in blood and charred marks. Groans were covered by panic screams. I saw young and old lifting metal, concrete, simmering timber. I did not see Bill. I kept running around the collapsed buildings, and I still could not find him. Could it be that he was underneath the rubbles? Where was he? He needed me, and I had to get to him. It was the saddest night of my life. I was first to find the spot underneath which Bill was. I barked and barked. I knew he was there, but could not hear him. As morning neared, people helped me uncover him. Eventually, he was lifted lifeless into a carriage. A doctor at the site looked at him briefly and shook his head. No one could figure out what I was and what I was doing. Everyone who knew how much Bill meant to me and me to him was gone. I was surrounded by strangers who had no idea of my sorrow. But I stayed at his side. Even when people tried to chase me away, I stayed as close to him as I could for 3 long days. On the 3rd day, I was waiting outside a big church. Bill had been taken inside. When the doors were reopened, a large crowd and melancholy singing flowed out. Bill was in a wooden box beside other wooden boxes. Women and men were weeping. They were saying, "They are now in heaven." And I kept thinking, how far is heaven? And how do I get there? I was about to find out. I walked with the crowd to a place covered with snow and carved stones. The procession stopped where big holes had been dug into the frozen ground. In one of them, they lowered Bill. There were so many flowers there that the winter acquired the fragrance of a warm summer day. And then everyone left. Once again, it was going to be just Bill and me, just as we always preferred it. I was exhausted, and I placed my head on some flowers and fell asleep for a long time. I woke up when a man was talking to me. He was gentle and took me to his house for a little food and a lot of water. As soon as the front door reopened, I dashed out and returned to Bill, and once again I lay down beside him. For a few more days, food was left for me, right beside where Bill and I had laid so close and yet so far apart. And it was there that I fell asleep for the last time. I finally felt a sense of peace and timelessness, as if I had slept for 10,000 years. And when I woke up, I was in heaven. And there was Bill waiting for me with a big smile. He held me in his arms, and I placed my head on his heart. And here, my story ends, in a place where everyone no longer fears the pain of separation. A grand, a blissful place, a special heaven for eternal soulmates.
My name is John Caddy. I had a younger brother who was a very curious lad who liked hanging out with his friends and seeing what kind of adventures they could have. On January 15th, 1895, his life was cut short just because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I realized that he and his friends were probably in danger when I felt the ground shake beneath my house at 429 Utah, and one of the pieces of metal called a rattlehead struck my home. A clock on the mantle fell off as I rushed out the door to find Alex and his friends. I lived only a couple blocks from his house, at 220 South Utah, but it seemed like it took forever to get to his house, only to realize that Alex was not at home. Knowing my brother, I knew exactly where he was. I immediately headed toward the fire. I saw a flash of light, so I took cover in a barn west of Arizona Street. Then came the second explosion, knocking me down, and a 10-inch pulley wheel landed on my feet. I looked out and saw what remained of the Butte Hardware building. After that, it seemed like hours, but was really only minutes, with the debris and cinders falling everywhere around me. I ran as fast as I could, but when I arrived there, I could tell that if Alex was there, he did not have a very good chance of survival. I couldn't think of anything else that I could do to find him, and reluctantly decided to return home, hoping that by some miracle he had been in another part of town and was safe at home. My first fear came true when I got there and he still wasn't home. I proceeded to my house, and when I opened the door, I saw the clock that sat on the mantel laying on the floor. When I picked it up, it was stopped at the exact moment of the first explosion and probably recorded Alex's time of death. I placed the clock back on the mantel and didn't bother to see if the clock still worked because I would never change the time again. It became a sad reminder of the time I lost my little brother. I believe the reason so many young men and boys died that night was because they think of themselves as invincible and able to handle any situation. They do not always realize how easily a life can be ended. I went on to testify at the inquest and trial to try to find justice for Alex and the other victims. I miss having my mischievous brother tagging along behind me.